It was a legendary escape from a place that was supposed to be inescapable. 55 years ago this month, three men pulled off the impossible, breaking out of Alcatraz.
A note on this script before we begin. In 2025 and 2026, dozens of videos and articles circulated online claiming the U.S. Marshals had found bodies, confirmed DNA, and officially closed the Alcatraz case. None of that is true. There is no official confirmation of what happened to the three men. The case is still open. What did happen in 2025 is arguably more interesting. A real, filmed, physical recreation of the escape by a team of science YouTubers, built on top of a decade of legitimate title research. This script tells that real story. For 63 years, three men have been listed as fugitives from a prison that no longer exists. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed its doors in March of 1963. The men who supposedly escaped it are, if alive, somewhere north of 90 years old. And yet, right now, in this exact moment, the United States Marshal Service still has an active file open on Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. Their case won't formally lapse until sometime between 2026 and 2031. The years each of them would turn 100. That's not a metaphor. That's not The Legend Lives On. That is a literal, standing federal warrant for a crime committed during the Kennedy administration against men who would need to have quietly outlived nearly everyone who ever looked for them. So when headlines started popping up in 2025 with titles like this one, claiming scientists had finally solved the Alcatraz escape, it's worth asking, what actually happened? Because the real answer is stranger, more careful, and ultimately more honest than the viral version. It doesn't end in a body count. It ends in a raft, a stopwatch, and three grown adults paddling toward the Golden Gate Bridge in the freezing dark, on purpose, in 2025, just to see if it could be done. To understand why that matters, we have to go back to the beginning. Alcatraz Island sits about a mile and a quarter off the coast of San Francisco, a jagged 22-acre outcrop that had already served as a military fort before the federal government converted it into a maximum security penitentiary in 1934. It wasn't built for ordinary criminals. It was built for the men other prisons couldn't hold. Inmates who had already escaped somewhere else, who had already proven the rules didn't apply to them. The math was simple and brutal. Alcatraz held a maximum of about 312 inmates, guarded by the lowest prisoner-to-guard ratio in the federal system. Cells were small, steel-barred, and stripped of anything resembling comfort. Privileges, visitation, work, even the ability to talk during meals, were earned, not given. Inmates were counted as many as 13 times a day. And then there was the water. Cold, fast-moving, and unpredictable. The currents of San Francisco Bay were treated by prison officials as a second set of walls, one nature built for free. In 14 documented escape attempts across the prison's 29 years of operation, the official record shows no one ever made it out alive. Most were recaptured. A handful drowned, or were presumed to have. That reputation, the idea that the bay itself was an unbeatable final obstacle, became part of Alcatraz's mythology long before June of 1962, which is exactly why what happened that month mattered so much. It wasn't just an escape. It was the first real crack in the story the prison had told about itself for 3 decades. Alcatraz had, after all, already held some of the most notorious names in American crime. Al Capone served time there, as did George "Machine Gun" Kelly. The prison's entire operating philosophy was built around one idea: containment, not rehabilitation. There was no illusion that Alcatraz would reform anyone. Its only job was to make sure nobody heard from these men again except through official channels. For 29 years, on paper at least, it did exactly that. That reputation wasn't just useful for public relations. It was, in a very real sense, the prison's actual security system. A guard-to-inmate ratio alone doesn't stop a determined, intelligent man from trying to leave. What stops him, or at least what the Bureau of Prisons was counting on, is the belief that trying is pointless. Convince every inmate on the island that the water outside is a death sentence, and you don't need triple the number of guards. You need the myth to hold. For nearly 3 decades, it did. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, transferred in after fleeing Louisiana State Penitentiary. According to the FBI's own historical account of the case, Morris had been orphaned by age 11, had a criminal record by 13, and by the time he reached the Rock, he had already built a resume of armed robbery and repeated prison escapes. He was, by every account, the smartest man in the group, the kind of inmate the prison had been specifically designed to hold. He wasn't alone for long. Brothers John and Clarence Anglin, two of 13 children from a farming family in rural Georgia and Florida, arrived not long after, having already tried and failed to escape the federal penitentiary in Atlanta so many times that officials simply shipped them to Alcatraz instead. All three men had crossed paths in earlier stints behind bars. At Alcatraz, they ended up in adjoining cells, along with a fourth conspirator, Allen West. Adjoining cells meant they could talk after lights out, and over the following months, according to FBI case records, that's exactly what they did, quietly building what would become one of the most patient, most engineered escape plans in American prison history. Working behind the vents beneath their sinks, the men chipped away at concrete that had been slowly weakened by decades of saltwater exposure. They used stolen spoons and scavenged saw blades, and eventually built a crude drill powered by a stolen vacuum cleaner motor. To keep the noise from giving them away, the digging was timed to music hour, a scheduled period when inmates were permitted to play instruments in their cells. Morris played the accordion. The wheeze of the bellows covered the grinding of metal against stone. To hide the growing holes during the day, they built fake vent covers out of cardboard and papier-mâché, painted to match the surrounding wall using pilfered art supplies from the prison's maintenance shop. And for the piece of the plan that would ultimately end up in the FBI's own official photographs, they sculpted dummy heads, built from soap, toilet paper, flesh-toned paint, and real human hair swept from the prison barbershop floor, and left them in their beds, tucked beneath blankets, positioned to catch a guard's flashlight at just the right angle during a walk-through head count. Behind the walls, the escapees had found their way into an unused utility corridor, and from there up to the top of a cell block, where they built a hidden workshop. It was there that they constructed their final and most improbable tool, a raft roughly 6 feet by 14 feet, stitched together from more than 50 stolen prison-issue raincoats, the seams melted and sealed using heat from the building's own steam pipes. They converted a small accordion-like concertina into a hand pump to inflate it. On the night of June 11, 1962, sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through their enlarged vents, climbed to the roof, and made their way to the northeastern shore of the island. Allen West, the fourth member of the plan, didn't make it. By his own later account to investigators, his final section of concrete simply wouldn't budge in time, and the others could not afford to wait for him. West stayed behind, and when guards discovered the empty cells and abandoned dummy heads the next morning, he was the one who explained, in detail, exactly how the others had done it. West's role in the story tends to get overshadowed, but it's arguably the most human part of the whole plan. He wasn't a bystander. He had been chipping through his own wall for months alongside the others, gathering the same tools, helping build the same dummy heads and the same raft. His escape simply failed on a technicality of timing. A few stubborn inches of crumbling cement that wouldn't give way fast enough on the one night it mattered. He was left behind not by betrayal, but by seconds. When the search began the next morning, West cooperated fully, walking investigators through the utility corridor, the rooftop route, and the intended destination of Angel Island, testimony that became the backbone of the FBI's official reconstruction of the escape. He served out his sentence and was transferred when Alcatraz shut its doors for good less than a year later, the only one of the four conspirators whose fate was never in question. Even setting aside what may or may not have happened once the men hit the water, the mechanics of getting off the island at all remain one of the more remarkable engineering stories in American criminal history. Remarkable enough that it's the part later recreations would zero in on decades later. The escapees didn't just dig a hole and run. They exploited a structural weakness the prison itself had allowed to develop. Decades of salt air and saltwater exposure had slowly corroded the concrete around the vents behind their sinks, turning solid masonry into something that could be worked loose with hand tools and patience. Once through, they found themselves in an unguarded utility corridor, original infrastructure from the building's days as a military fortification, largely forgotten by a prison staff focused on the cell block itself rather than the crumbling machinery behind it. From there, the climb to freedom was almost absurdly literal. The men scaled roughly 30 feet up a plumbing shaft using the pipes themselves as a ladder, pried open a vent cover at the top, and to avoid raising suspicion from any guard who noticed a loosened bolt, molded a fake replacement bolt out of soap to hold the cover in place until the night they were ready to leave for good. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about the level of care in the plan. These were men thinking several steps ahead, accounting for a guard's passing glance weeks in advance. The manhunt that followed was immediate and enormous. Within days, according to the FBI, a sealed packet of the men's personal letters, wrapped in rubber to keep them dry, was recovered from the water. Paddle fragments and pieces of a homemade life vest turned up over the following week, some near Angel Island, some closer to the Golden Gate Bridge. What was never found, not that week, not in the 6 decades since, were the men themselves. No bodies, no fingerprints on file anywhere in the country, no credible sighting that investigators were ever able to verify. The FBI kept the case open for 17 years before officially closing it on December 31st, 1979. Their conclusion, based on circumstantial evidence and the collective judgment of Bay Current's experts at the time, was that the raft likely broke apart. The men succumbed to hypothermia in water hovering around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and their bodies were carried out to sea. That's still the FBI's stated historical position today. But here's the detail that gets lost in most retellings. The FBI closing its file didn't end the case. It just handed it to someone else. Responsibility for the investigation passed to the U.S. Marshal Service, whose fugitive division does not share the FBI's conclusion that the men are dead, or at least, isn't willing to say so outright. The Marshal Service has never declared Morris or the Anglins deceased. It has, at various points, released computer-generated age-progressed photographs showing what the 3 men might look like in their 80s and 90s, and it has continued to field and investigate tips for decades. That's the real headline hiding underneath all the fake ones. 2 federal agencies have, for more than 40 years, quietly disagreed with each other about whether these men are alive. In 2013, the case resurfaced in dramatic fashion. A letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department's Richmond Station, addressed to law enforcement, allegedly written by John Anglin himself. Portions of its contents were later made public by CBS San Francisco. "My name is John Anglin," the letter reportedly read. "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter claimed Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence in 2011, leaving John as the sole survivor. It offered a deal, a brief, guaranteed prison term in exchange for medical treatment, with a promise to reveal his location if authorities agreed publicly, on television. The FBI ran the letter through forensic handwriting analysis and tested it for usable fingerprints and DNA. The results, by the Bureau's own account, were inconclusive, not a match, but not a clear fake either. No television announcement was ever made. No further message ever arrived. The U.S. Marshals ultimately told local media they considered the lead closed with no real merit, treating it as a probable hoax, though not one they could definitively prove. It wasn't the first supposed message from the escapees, either. In the days immediately following the 1962 escape, the FBI received a taunting postcard reading, "Ha ha ha, we made it. Frank, John, and Clarence." Later dismissed after fingerprint and handwriting comparisons failed to match. Family members of the Anglin brothers have also long claimed that relatives received and signed roses and Christmas cards for years after the escape, and that a photograph surfaced in the 1970s purportedly showing John and Clarence together in Brazil in 1975. A photo the Marshal Service has publicly stated it has never been able to verify as authentic. None of this amounts to proof, but it's also not nothing, which is exactly why the case has refused to close for 6 decades. There's also a piece of eyewitness testimony from the night of the escape itself that rarely makes it into the shorter retellings. A San Francisco police officer named Robert Checky told the FBI that while standing at the St. Francis Yacht Harbor on the mainland, he spotted an unusual boat, sitting motionless in the bay near Alcatraz, pale, quiet, running without lights. After roughly 15 minutes, it moved off toward the Golden Gate Bridge. It was, at the time, illegal for any unauthorized vessel to come within several hundred yards of the island, which is exactly what made the sighting notable. The FBI considered it and ultimately didn't pursue it seriously, concluding early on that the men's raft had most likely broken apart in the water rather than been met by an accomplice. But it's the kind of detail that, combined with everything else, keeps amateur investigators and true crime researchers coming back to the case file even now. Here's where the real 2025 story starts to take shape. And it begins, in fact, back in 2014. That year, a team of researchers at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, led by hydrologist Rolf Hutt, built a computer model of San Francisco Bay's currents as they would have existed on the night of June 11, 1962. Their goal wasn't to prove the men survived. It was simpler and more rigorous. Figure out where the bay's tides would have physically carried a raft launched from Alcatraz at a given time, and see if survival was even hydrodynamically plausible. The findings were specific almost to the minute. If the escapees left the island precisely between 11 p.m. and midnight, a window that lines up closely with the estimated 10:30 to 11 p.m. timeframe prison officials gave the FBI, the currents could plausibly have carried a raft toward the area near the Golden Gate Bridge, rather than out into the open Pacific. Leave earlier or later than that narrow window, according to the model, and the odds dropped sharply. As Hutt put it at the time, the men wouldn't have needed to be strong swimmers so much as good at reading a tide table. If you ever have energy to spare, it would be in that situation, pointing to how the currents themselves could have done a lot of the work, provided the timing was close to exact. That study didn't solve anything. It reframed the question. Before Delft's modeling, the assumption, baked into decades of FBI statements, was that the bay made survival essentially impossible regardless of skill or planning. After it, the honest answer became, survival was improbable, but not the fantasy it had been treated as, provided the escapees timed their launch with real precision. And by every account of how meticulously Morris planned literally everything else about the escape, the fake vents, the dummy heads, the months of patient digging, precision was exactly the one trait he had in abundance. This brings us to the real anchor of this story, the part of 2025 that isn't a hoax. In November 2025, engineer and YouTuber Mark Rober, along with journalists Johnny Harris and Cleo Abram, published a video documenting an attempt to physically recreate the Alcatraz escape using period-accurate materials and methods, the same category of raincoat raft construction, the same rough tools, the same starting point on the island, and the same general tidal conditions the Delft researchers had modeled. It wasn't a forensic investigation. It was an engineering test, in the spirit of past attempts by shows like Mythbusters, to see whether a historically documented feat was actually physically achievable, rather than just theoretically possible on paper. According to accounts of the video and its accompanying behind-the-scenes footage, the team built their raft using the same era-appropriate approach, rubberized fabric sealed with heat rather than modern adhesive, paddled rather than motorized, and launched from a similar point on Alcatraz Island, riding the bay's currents rather than fighting them. All three reached a landing point near the Golden Gate Bridge, consistent with where the original raft debris and personal effects were actually recovered back in 1962. It's worth being precise about what that does and doesn't prove. It doesn't confirm that Morris and the Anglin brothers survived. It can't. Nobody in 2025 was risking hypothermia in 50-degree water with 1962 grade gear and no rescue plan. And the current conditions on any given night in 2025 aren't identical to those on June 11, 1962. What the recreation does confirm, the same way the Delft study did, just more viscerally, is that the physical act of surviving that crossing on a well-timed raft made from raincoats was achievable. Not a certainty, not a myth. Achievable. That's a meaningfully different statement than the mystery is solved. And it's also, frankly, a more honest one, which is part of why it didn't generate the same flood of viral headlines that the fabricated bodies found stories did. A careful "this was physically possible" doesn't travel as fast online as a fake case closed. Here's the part that tends to get buried under all the noise. Even without a body, a DNA match, or a confirmed sighting, the case has never been treated as fully resolved by the one agency actually responsible for finding these men if they're alive. The U.S. Marshal Service's fugitive investigators have said, on record, over the years, that leads still occasionally come in, old, mostly unverifiable, but not zero. Retired marshals who worked the case for decades have described it in interviews as the kind of file that just never goes away. Less because of hard evidence, and more because nothing has ever definitively closed the door either way. The wanted posters are still, as of this writing, technically active. The case will not formally lapse until the men would have turned 100 years old, a legal formality more than an expectation, but a formality the government has never chosen to waive early. It's also worth pointing out plainly what a 2025 solved headline would actually require to be true. Either recovered remains with a confirmed DNA match to Morris or the Anglin family, or a living person definitively identified through fingerprints or DNA as one of the three. Neither of those things has happened. Not in 2025, not since. Anyone claiming otherwise, and there were a lot of those claims last year, was not reporting news. They were reusing a viral template with invented quotes attached to invented officials. Not the ending. The evidence. What changed is that a legitimate, decade-old piece of tidal science got a real-world stress test, filmed and documented by people with genuine engineering and journalism backgrounds, adding a physical data point to a mystery that had, until then, only ever been argued over on paper. What changed is that the gap between the FBI says they probably drowned and the Marshal Service refuses to say they're dead got a little more visible to a mainstream audience. And what changed, unfortunately, is that a case with 60 years of built-in intrigue became an irresistible target for content mills willing to invent a fake resolution because the truth, still unsolved, but here's some real new evidence, takes more effort to tell honestly. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers may have drowned within an hour of leaving their cells, exactly as the FBI concluded in 1979. Or they may have ridden a well-timed current to a stretch of shoreline near the Golden Gate Bridge and quietly disappeared into ordinary American life for however many decades their bodies allowed. Both of those stories are still, technically, on the table. Neither one is solved. What is true is this. 3 men built dummy heads out of soap and hair, drilled through concrete with a stolen spoon and a vacuum motor, sewed a boat out of raincoats, and left a maximum security island in the middle of the night on a plan that had never worked for anyone else in the prison's history. 63 years later, engineers rebuilt that same plan, piece for piece, and rowed it to shore. Whatever happened to Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin on the night of June 11, 1962, real science has finally confirmed one thing for certain. It could have worked. The rest, for now, is still open.